Not for missing targets, not for attitude problems, not for anything I actually did wrong. I was fired because the owner's son-in-law wanted my office for his university roommate. Let me back up. I spent 22 years at Dunmore & Associates, a commercial property management firm based out of Calgary. We handled industrial parks, mixed-use developments, retail portfolios, the unglamorous side of real estate that nobody talks about at dinner parties but that keeps the lights on for a lot of businesses across Alberta. I started there at 34, fresh off a rough stretch after my first marriage ended, and I needed something to anchor me. The work did that. The clients did that. Over 2 decades, I built a client portfolio that represented just over 60% of the firm's annual revenue. 41 clients. Some of them I'd known since before their companies had more than 10 employees. I'd walked properties with them in February when it was -30 and nobody else wanted to be outside. I'd taken calls on Christmas Eve when a pipe burst in one of their buildings. I'd negotiated lease renewals that saved a few of them from having to close up entirely during the rough years. That's not something you manufacture. That's just time and showing up. The founder, a man named Elliot Dunmore, was 71 when he stepped back. His health had been declining for a couple of years. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age and 2 knee replacements and a heart that his cardiologist was watching closely. He'd built the firm from nothing in the 80s, and I had a lot of respect for him. He was blunt, sometimes difficult, but he was fair and he understood the business in a way that felt almost physical, like he could walk into a building and know within 10 minutes whether it was being managed properly. His daughter had been around the firm for a few years in a marketing capacity. Smart woman, good instincts, but she'd made it clear she wasn't interested in operations. When Elliot announced he was stepping back, most of us assumed the day-to-day would go to one of the senior managers, myself included as a possibility, or at minimum a promoted version of the current operations lead. What we got instead was her husband. His name was Spencer, and I want to be careful here because I'm not interested in being unfair to him. He wasn't a bad person. He was 31 years old, had an MBA from a school in Ontario I'd never heard of, and had spent the previous 4 years doing something in brand consulting that I could never fully understand when he tried to explain it. What he knew about property management when he walked through our doors could have fit on a Post-it note. That's not an insult. It's just true. I tried, genuinely, to give him the benefit of the doubt. In his first month, I took him on client visits, walked him through our portfolio management software, explained the Alberta rental framework and how commercial leases here differ from what he might have encountered in his previous work. He was personable. He asked reasonable questions. I thought, okay, maybe this works. The problem started around the 3-month mark. Spencer had ideas. Most of them were rebranding ideas. New logo, new website, new name possibly, shifting the firm's identity toward something that sounded more like a tech startup than a property management company. He brought in a friend of his to consult on digital transformation, a phrase that got used so often in those months that I started wincing every time I heard it. The friend had no background in real estate. None. Meanwhile, actual operational decisions were getting delayed or quietly reversed. A lease renewal I'd been negotiating for 8 months with one of our anchor clients got paused because Spencer wanted to reassess our pricing strategy. The client, a logistics company that had been with us for 14 years, called me directly, confused and a little frustrated, wanting to know what was going on. I didn't have a good answer. I started documenting things. Not out of paranoia, but because I'd been around long enough to know that when leadership changes and things start going sideways, paper trails matter. I kept records of conversations, decisions that were delayed, client concerns that weren't being addressed. I mentioned some of this to my colleague, a woman named Vivienne who'd been with the firm nearly as long as I had. She told me to be careful. She was right. About 8 months after Spencer took over, I was called into a meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. No agenda. Just Spencer and the firm's HR consultant, a woman I'd worked with a few times over the years on routine matters. There was a folder on the table. Spencer opened it, and I remember the particular way he did it. Casual, almost bored. Like this was a minor administrative task he wanted to get through before lunch. He told me the firm was restructuring, that my role was being eliminated, and that my last day would be the end of the week. I asked him to be specific. He wasn't. He said something about strategic realignment and shifting priorities. When I pushed, "I've been here 22 years, I'd like to understand what this actually means." He said, and I remember this clearly, that the firm's direction was moving in ways that required different expertise. Different expertise. The HR consultant slid a package across the table. Termination terms, NDA, a non-solicitation agreement. The non-solicitation was what caught my eye. It prohibited me from contacting any current client of the firm for 24 months. I didn't sign anything that afternoon. I said I needed to review the documents with my lawyer. Spencer looked mildly annoyed. The HR consultant told me I had 5 business days. I drove home on Deerfoot Trail in rush hour traffic. 22 years running through my head. The first property I'd ever managed for the firm, a squat industrial building near the airport that had a loading dock that never quite worked right. The client who'd sent a bottle of scotch every Christmas for 15 years running. The deals that had gone badly and the ones that had gone better than anyone expected. The 2 younger colleagues I'd mentored who were now running their own books of business. I called my lawyer that evening. She's someone I've used for personal matters over the years, wills, a real estate transaction, but she referred me to an employment lawyer she trusted. I had a call booked for the next morning. Here's what I learned. In Alberta, a 22-year employee in a senior role is entitled to reasonable notice under common law, and the package Spencer had offered me was, according to my lawyer, significantly below what the courts would likely award. The non-solicitation clause was broad, potentially enforceable in part, but its scope and duration were aggressive in a way that a judge might well find unreasonable. The NDA was fairly standard. My lawyer's advice was direct. Don't sign anything yet. Counter on the package and wait. The thing about the non-solicitation agreement is that it only restricts me from contacting clients. It says nothing about clients contacting me. I didn't reach out to anyone. I want to be clear about that. I went home, I told my wife what had happened, I took a few days to sit with it, and I started quietly doing what I should have done years earlier, putting together the groundwork for my own firm. The calls started coming on day 3. The first was from the logistics company, the one whose lease renewal had been paused. The operations manager, a man I've been working with for over a decade, had heard through whatever internal grapevine exists in the Calgary commercial real estate world that I was no longer at Dunmore. He called my cell, the same number I'd had for 15 years, and asked me directly what was going on. I told him I'd left the firm and was exploring next steps. I didn't say anything negative about Dunmore. I didn't need to. He said, "Well, we're going to need someone to handle our portfolio." Over the following 3 weeks, I received calls from 19 clients. 19. Some I'd worked with for over a decade, some for 5 or 6 years, but all of them had my direct number, and all of them, apparently, had noticed that things had changed. I registered Caldwell Property Partners. I've been using my middle name professionally for years, and it felt right to anchor the firm there in the second week. My wife, who works in accounting, helped me set up the books. I found shared office space in a building in Beltline that I'd actually managed for a client years earlier. The property manager there gave me a good deal. Small mercies. By the time my non-solicitation review period had ended, the 5 business days Spencer had given me to sign, I hadn't signed. My lawyer had sent a counterproposal on the termination package, and I had 17 confirmed client commitments already in place. Spencer's side went quiet for a bit after the counter. Then they came back with a slightly improved offer, still below what was appropriate. My lawyer pushed again. Eventually, we reached a settlement that I'm not going to detail, but that was meaningfully better than what they'd initially offered. The non-solicitation clause, notably, did not appear in the final settlement agreement. My lawyer had flagged it as unenforceable in its original form, and Spencer's side, probably on advice from their own counsel, dropped it entirely. By the end of my 3rd month running Caldwell, I had 23 clients. Several of them I'd had to work to re-onboard from scratch, dealing with whatever had happened to their files and relationships in the intervening months. A few had called me with genuine complaints, not about me, but about what had happened to their portfolios in the period after I left. Decisions that hadn't been made, calls that hadn't been returned. One client told me they'd been dealing with Spencer's friend, the digital transformation consultant, on a maintenance escalation matter. The friend had apparently been sitting in on client calls as some kind of shadow advisor. The client, a retail property owner who'd been with Dunmore for over a decade, had found it bizarre and had started looking for alternatives before he even knew I'd left. I heard from Vivienne about 8 weeks after I'd set up the firm. She'd resigned. She told me Spencer had brought in his university roommate to fill what was essentially her role, at a higher title and presumably higher salary, despite the fact that the roommate's background was in hospitality management. She wasn't bitter about it, or at least she didn't sound it. She was already in conversations with 2 other firms. The Dunmore situation deteriorated over the following months in ways I mostly only heard about secondhand through the Calgary commercial real estate community, which is not large and is not quiet. The technology overhaul that Spencer had prioritized was over budget and still unfinished 6 months in. Several more senior staff had resigned or been let go. At least one major institutional client, a property fund out of Edmonton that had helped onboard years earlier, had pulled their Alberta portfolio management entirely and gone to a competitor. I don't know exactly where Dunmore & Associates stands today. I know the firm is smaller than it was. I know Elliot Dunmore, from what I've heard, has not been pleased. I know that Spencer is still there, though what his actual role involves now, I couldn't say. What I know for certain is this. In my first full year running Caldwell Property Partners, we managed a portfolio worth approximately $94 million in assessed property value across Alberta. I hired 2 people, one of whom was a former Dunmore employee who'd reached out to me, which I want to be clear, I had not solicited. We have a small office, a lean operation, and a client renewal rate, after year 1 of 100%. There's something I want to say here that I've thought about carefully, because I don't want it to come out wrong. I'm not telling this story because I'm angry. I was angry for a while in that particular hot way you feel when something profoundly unfair happens and you're watching it happen and you can't stop it. But that passed. What I want to say is that when you spend 22 years building something, relationships, a reputation, a way of working that doesn't belong to the firm that employs you, it travels with you. The clients knew that. They'd always known that, even when I hadn't fully understood it myself. Spencer made a business decision that probably seemed straightforward to him at the time. Clear the senior people who represented the old guard, bring in his own network, modernize the brand. On paper, maybe that made sense. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood without having actually done this work, was that the value wasn't in the portfolio software or the letterhead or the office on the 14th floor. It was in the relationship. It was in being the person someone calls on a Saturday morning when their building has a problem. You can't inherit that. You have to earn it. My first week running Caldwell, I drove out to the industrial park near the airport. Different client now, different building, but the same stretch of road I'd been driving for 22 years. It was a Thursday, and it was cold the way Calgary is cold in November, that particular wind that comes off the mountains and goes right through you. I walked the property, I made notes, I called the tenant with a question about their lease renewal timeline. That was it. That was the whole job. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I think about that Tuesday afternoon a lot, not with bitterness. That's not what this is, but with a kind of clarity I didn't have before. Spencer slid that folder across the table like it was nothing. 22 years, and it took him about 4 minutes to explain that I was done. What he didn't understand, and what I couldn't have articulated clearly in that moment either, was that the folder didn't actually contain what he thought it did: the termination notice, the non-solicitation clause, the tidy little package. All of it was built on an assumption that the value of what I did lived inside the firm's walls, that it belonged to Dunmore & Associates by virtue of the letterhead. It didn't. It never did. Here's what I've come to believe. After working through all of it, the clients didn't follow me because I was exceptional or because I had some particular talent that couldn't be replaced. They followed me because over 22 years, I'd shown them consistently who I was. I returned calls. I showed up when it was inconvenient. I told them the truth when the truth wasn't what they wanted to hear. That's not a skill set you list on a resume. It's just a way of conducting yourself, day after day, until people know they can count on you without having to wonder. That's the thing about integrity, and I use that word carefully because it gets thrown around. It's not a strategy. Spencer, I think, understood business as a series of strategic moves. Bring in the right people, rebrand the image, modernize the systems. And those things matter, but they don't matter more than whether your clients trust you at a basic human level. When he replaced me with his university roommate and brought in a consultant who'd never managed a property in his life, he wasn't just making a personnel decision. He was communicating something to every client in that portfolio about what the firm actually valued. They heard it clearly, even if he didn't intend to send the message. What I did in those months after, the counter-proposal, the incorporation, the slow and careful rebuilding, required something I hadn't fully tested in myself before. I had to think clearly when I was angry. I had to be patient when I wanted to act. I had to resist the impulse to call clients directly, even when I knew they were struggling with whoever had taken over their files. That restraint wasn't passive. It was a choice I made every day, and it cost something. There's a version of this story where I make a few phone calls, get the clients lined up quickly, and everything resolves cleanly. But that version would have compromised something I wasn't willing to compromise. My lawyer's advice was sound, and I followed it. I let things unfold the way they were going to unfold. And they did. Vivienne called me after she resigned and said something I've thought about since. She said the worst part wasn't being replaced. It was watching them not understand what they were losing. I think she was right. Spencer never understood what the firm actually was. He inherited a structure without understanding the thing that animated it. And so when the people who built that thing left, quietly, professionally, without drama, the structure started to hollow out from the inside. I'm not glad Dunmore struggled. Elliot built something real over 35 years, and whatever happens to it now isn't what he deserved. But I am glad I handled my part of it the way I did. That I didn't sign what I shouldn't have signed. That I built something new with the same approach I'd always used. That on a cold Thursday in November, I was walking a property in Calgary doing the actual work, and that was enough. You don't need to burn anything down. You just need to know what you're carrying and keep carrying it.